told. They got told. There was an angel saying Jesus is alive. No mention of it. Yeah? They get told off over, not believing the scriptures, not reading the scriptures properly. Okay, and so what happens then? Like Jesus says, you didn't read the scriptures well. And so what happens? What's the next thing? The greatest Bible study in all of history. Yeah? Jesus himself is explaining to two people everything concerning himself. But think carefully, what's going on? He goes, beginning at Moses, Old Testament, and the prophets, he expounds to them in all the scriptures, Old Testament, all the things concerning himself. So what is Luke saying to us? He's saying that the scriptures speak about Christ. This is exactly what St. Paul was saying. This is exactly what the Creed was saying. This idea that the Old Testament speaks about Christ. And we should have a sense of something that we kind of already know. When you guys read the Old Testament, easy or difficult? Seriously, like with all the questions that I ask you tonight, how long you'll stumble over? Easy or difficult? Difficult, thank you. It was difficult for them. You're not alone. This is not news, yeah? But what was the thing that helped them? The risen Jesus coming and helping them out. Yeah, that's what we need, right? We need, like 100%, we need the risen Jesus to come and help us out with this Bible study. 100%, I agree with you. We'll see how that happens though, right? See how that happens. Continue on with the story, unless there are any questions, thoughts? No? Okay. Oh, and tell me when I need to be quiet. Like, when do I need to? Otherwise, 10 minutes? Sure. Okay, I'll try. Then they drew near to the village where they were going, and he indicated that he would have gone farther, but they constrained him, saying, "Abide with us, for it is towards evening, and the day is fast spent." And he went in to stay with them. Now it came to pass, as he sat at the table with them, that he took bread, blessed and broke, and gave it to them. Then their eyes were opened, and they knew him, and he vanished from their sight. Now it came to pass, as he sat at the table with them, that he took bread, blessed and broke it, and gave it to them. Then their eyes were opened, and they knew him, and he vanished from their sight. And they said to one another, "Did not our heart burn within us while he talked with us on the road, and while he opened the scriptures to us?" So they rose that very hour, and returned to Jerusalem, and found the 11, and those who were with them gathered together, saying, "The Lord is risen indeed, and he appeared to Simon." And they told about the things that had happened on the road, and how he was known to them in the breaking of the bread. When did they know that it was Christ? Yeah. They had a liturgy on the road to Emmaus. Opening the scriptures, breaking the bread, Jesus. Yeah? That whole, it's the one thing. That's why the biggest, the most important thing that St. Paul is handing over is liturgy, scripture. Yeah? He's handing over the very means by which you come to meet the risen Christ. So when we're asking, but they had the risen Christ, explain all the scriptures to them. That's exactly what we want, right? That's exactly what we have. Does that make sense? Okay. Now, there are there's one really important thing, so that's two parts. It's not Jesus hands over the scriptures. It's not Jesus gives over the bread. Jesus opens the scriptures, which means they will what? What's the other one? There we go, that's a tertiary education. And the bread is broken. They're not fit for us to get straight away. There's a certain entering into it. Yeah? We need to open the scriptures, we need to break the bread. Yeah? There's a certain sort of passage into it. It's not as simple as a passive receiving. Yeah? There's a bit of work to be done. Okay. Now, I'm going to keep on going. We'll see how we go. Now, I want to give you at least an example of this sort of reading, and I can give you 1,000,001 more after, but I want you to at least see it working. Okay? Now, the claim is this. The claim is this. that, actually, so there are a few, I said you I brought some books, right? Now, some of these I would urge you to read. This one, reading backwards, 100% urge you to read. 100%. If you need help reading it, by all means, it's not the easiest of reads. It's probably one of the most important reads I've ever had in my entire life. Okay? Because it details more of this. Yeah? And most beautifully, it explains, let me see if I can try to explain this properly. You tell me if this doesn't make sense, because I would have screwed up pretty hard if this doesn't make sense. This idea of reading the Old Testament and finding Christ is exactly what Matthew, Mark, Luke and John do in their Gospels. If we want to try to understand why, we were saying before, the Old Testament seems to be the thing that holds everything, but we jump for the New Testament. I think the greatest way it's ever been said, as far as I'm concerned, and I'll be out myself because I was the one who said it. The New Testament is the way to read the Old Testament, but with training wheels. Okay? So if you go to Mark and you read the Gospel of Mark, you see very early on, what's one of the first things he says? Go to the beginning of the Gospel of Mark, first chapter, first verse. The beginning of the Gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God, full stop, first sentence, second sentence. As it is written in the prophets. We've barely got in, and he's already jumped into the Old Testament. Yeah? So if St. Mark is doing something with the Old Testament, we should probably know what he's doing with the Old Testament. We should probably try to investigate. What is he doing with the Old Testament? Because that means that it's something that we should be doing with the Old Testament. He's saying, behold, I send my messenger before your face, who will prepare your way before you. The voice of one crying in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord, make his paths straight. What's that in reference to? You guys know that. What's that in reference to? Yeah, John the Baptist, right? John the Baptist, he's the one who prepares the way of the Lord, making his path straight. And then, who is it that comes after him? Jesus, right? Now, in the Old Testament, if you read through those passages, who is the one that comes after? It's the Lord. It is God. Yeah? Now, why is this a difference? Why is this a point to make? Do your best to be a bit Jewish right now. Forget Jesus for a moment. I know. Just do me a favor, try and be a bit Jewish. Forget Jesus. And see what the effect of reading this would be if you could try to understand what St. Mark is doing with the Old Testament. Yeah? We read it as... what was the first thing that happened? St. John the Baptist comes on the scene, baptizes Jesus, and then Jesus sort of takes over that ministry. Yeah? He's the new person on the scene. John sort of fades in the distance. Jesus is the one who's sort of starting his ministry there. Okay? So whose way is prepared? Jesus's. Whose, the voice of one crying in the wilderness, make straight whose path? Jesus's. But if you read in the Old Testament, whose path is it? It's God. So what is St. Mark doing? He's saying that this person Jesus, this man Jesus that we all sort of know and love, is identified with God himself. Right? St. Mark is making an incredible claim by way of the Old Testament, saying, the very person who you know, he is the Lord who is coming. Right?
It's in Isaiah 40 verse 3. Isaiah 40 verse 3, it says, the voice of one crying in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord, make straight in the desert a highway for our God. I'd never noticed that till now.
Right, a highway for our God. It's completely unambiguous. Who are we waiting for? God. No less than God. So when people try and look to the New Testament and say, yeah, but okay. Some of you may have heard this, some of you may not have. There is this sort of trend that's slowly dying out, but it's very slow. This idea that when you look to the Gospels, at no point does Jesus really say, I'm God, I'm divine, worship me. Yeah? there are some people who I know who have come up and said, John, I get the feeling that that's kind of true. That he doesn't really, like, you don't see Jesus on every page saying, I'm divine. Yeah? So maybe there's something wrong. Yeah? Maybe we've got it wrong. We have to sort of be really attentive to what Matthew, Mark, Luke and John are doing in their gospel. First is this idea that the Old Testament is speaking about Christ. The justification for that is the resurrection. Yeah? It's the risen Christ that leads us to read the Old Testament in a particular way. And what do we find when we read the Old Testament in a particular way? We see that it's a figure of Christ. It's a way of explaining, like it could be, like one way of explaining it, is it's a massive metaphor or a series of images that explain to us who Christ is. Yeah? So that for example, if you go through this book, the idea is that Moses is a type of Christ. He's the one that leads his people into the promised land away from slavery. Yeah, that's one image by which we understand the work of Christ. He leads us out of slavery. Joshua would be another image because he leads us into the promised land. Isaac is an image of Christ because he is bound up and offered as a sacrifice by his father. You've got who else? Jonah, 100%. I'm struggling to think of the entire Old Testament now. Jonah as a type of being in the belly of the earth, and then coming up 3 days later. All of these narratives in the Old Testament are given by the New Testament writers as images by which we can understand who Christ is. Yeah? That's the way in which the early church was reading the Old Testament. So that's the way that's given to us.
But why does I'm reading the idea that the Old Testament needs the influence of Jesus to be made known, whereas the New Testament is more like I can maybe read it and comprehend it more easily. Why is that?
It's the idea that we were saying before. The New Testament is the Old Testament with training wheels. Yeah?
I think if you anchor the Old Testament in Christ, then as always saying, basically if you anchor the Christ as the core, then everything you read will make sense out of it.
And to be as specific as we can be, we're not this should be clear. We're not trying to understand the Old Testament. Trying to understand the Old Testament for the Old Testament's sake, no one cares. What we're trying to do, what the early church was doing, what they achieved, was understanding the person of Christ, and more than that, understanding the person of Christ and the church by reference to the Old Testament. Yeah? It was the Old Testament that was the series of images that were being referred back to in order to illustrate who Christ was. It wasn't, I'm trying to understand Moses better. It wasn't that. It was, I want to understand Christ better. And how do I do that? St. Matthew, he compares him to Moses. And by way of illustrating who Jesus is through Moses, he explains that he is the one who is leading us out of slavery. Yeah?
I remember once, I think John was with us in the camp and he mentioned this, that even the story of creation itself, when he created Adam and Eve, even that depiction of creation of Adam and Eve, it was actually because God saw the crucifixion, or he had in his mind, him being pierced, and through that image, and him being pierced, the church was born. That image was then used to create humanity.
Yeah, exactly. This idea of Adam. Okay, so think Adam, Jesus, right? Adam, we know the story of how Eve is created and all the rest. Adam goes to sleep, out of his side, rib is taken, Eve is formed, and then Eve is sort of handed back as the bride of Adam. Jesus dies, right? Out of his side, blood and water, baptism, the Eucharist. That's the very essence of the church. The church is then handed back as what we say the church is the bride of who? Christ. Yeah. Those are the those are the images, what I'm saying, those are the images from the Old Testament that we receive. And the way of reading, which is also something we receive, was a way to illustrate who Christ is, what Christ does. Does that make sense? Yeah, by all means, I can like not answer it, but go for it. Go for it.
The scripture is there to sort of be a reference to Christ, to speak of the life that we're living. Then how can we consolidate that with maybe the hardship that sort of humanity saw in the Old Testament that we don't see in the New?
Sorry, how do you mean like the hardship that humanity saw?
We had a lot of like violence and a lot of like, oh yes, so the Lord is the Lord that did it.
Mm.
And you know, it's like God and because I am seeing one family with them. And I'm not saying that humanity is zealous of God, but yeah, like how do we say, and this life is like Christ?
Okay, so this is part of like where we get into like new aspects of this reading. Okay, the first thing would be that this reading is something that the early church dealt with. The second part would be, what does that mean for how we understand the Old Testament? The Old Testament necessarily needs to be understood not on its own terms, yeah, not on its own terms. It's understood through Christ, as what I'm saying. Yeah, you understand it through Christ. Again, this book particularly good for that. Now, the ways in which we deal with like violence in the Old Testament, things like that, are varied based on like who you sort of ask. Okay, so there's no dogmatic stance on this. So there's no point at which I can say we have to read it this way or we can't read it this way or whatever. But I would suggest to you some particular readings. My favourite would be St. Gregory of Nyssa. That would be. He's in here somewhere. There it is. Okay, the life of Moses. Okay, so what St. Gregory of Nyssa does is he writes a book about the lessons to learn from the life of Moses. Okay, so he writes about the life of Moses. First part of the book. The second part of the book is that particular reading that we're talking about, but now in terms of the church, the experience of the church. How is the experience of the church illuminated by reading the Old Testament in this way? He comes up to the passage where it talks about the firstborn, like son, being killed. His claim is that that is morally reprehensible. Like, there's no way of justifying it. He's 100% sure there's no way of justifying it. So, which is like, I'm a bit worried there. But his point is, that's not the level at which we read. Yeah? At no point do we have to defend a literal sort of account of that death. Yeah? And he goes on to say, the way in which we understand it is based on the phrase in the Psalms. It's a similar sort of problematic. Does anyone know like Boney M? Has anyone heard of Boney M? By the rivers of Babylon, where we sat down. It's a psalm. Yeah, dash your little ones against the rock. It's like starts kind of happy, because like in my head it starts off with a Boney M tune. It gets really dark at the end. It's May. I think it's like may someone repay you for the evil that you have committed. May they dash your little ones, your babies, against the rocks. Yeah. It's not fun. But the way in which St. Gregory is understanding it, he's saying, don't try to understand it as a proper sanction of like genocide. Don't try and understand it as a sanction of killing the young. The message that should be gotten from it is at the level of reading it as speaking of the church. Yeah, which is exactly what St. Paul were doing, Matthew, Mark, Luke are doing, exactly what the New Testament writers are doing. And for him, the understanding was the little ones, like to dash your little ones against the rocks, that idea of like a whole generation not coming after you again, like in sort of, like any sort of like war, if you are going to like wipe out like your enemies, you should kill women and children. Why? Because that guarantees that there's no generation that comes up after it that'll come back and kill you later. Yeah? And so St. Gregory is saying it's not a manual on war. This is how we fight sin. So at the very like opening of sin, at the very like young sort of appearance of sin, cut it off, kill it. Be absolutely ruthless with sin. And that's the way that he understands it. And so in terms of like literal history or not, he completely neglects it. He has no qualms about saying it's not a thing. And I mean, there's more scandalous sort of things that you get from different writers as well. Ideas, for example, Origen, saying, I'll get it exactly because, yeah, Eric Holmes comes in. No, because these are, I mean, the thing that's weird here is that these feel like incredibly new ways of reading here. So this is Origen speaking about, he's talking about the Gospel of John, but he's sort of speaking more generally. He says their intention, the New Testament writers, the Old or New Testament writers, their intention was to speak the truth spiritually and materially at the same time where that was possible, but where it was not possible in both ways, to prefer the spiritual to the material. The spiritual truth is often preserved in the material falsehood, so to speak. Now, not everyone will agree with Origen, 100%. But the reason I bring that up is because the very people like St. Gregory of Nyssa and like St. Gregory the theologian, like the people who are like the champions of our sort of exegetical, like biblical reading history, follow him. Yeah? Now, what we make of those Old Testament violent passages, no, that's still up for grabs. There's nothing dogmatic that's said. But I think, personally, I find that rather like comforting. That I'm not trying to justify, no, God definitely did it and it definitely was a good thing and I have to be okay with like hundreds of people being killed, and especially like the death of the innocents. Like St. Gregory of Nyssa really like plays on it. He goes, it's young kids. It's not, and it wasn't their sin. It's not like Pharaoh's child was running around like, I don't know, as a tyrant. Like he could be.
I think that there is no, like, there's another dimension that sometimes we put ourselves in the mind of God and we assume His own wisdom in making decisions later. So I think we just truth what you're saying there, and they have to pull the spiritual from it, lessons and so forth. But please we also be careful not to put ourselves in the place of God and say, you know, you're wrong or you're right. These are things that happen, and it's up to the Lord that He permitted or otherwise. It's not something for us to, in a way, try to criticize or make sense of.
It's not a point of criticism. I mean, I think the safest way, like if you wanted to try to understand the safest way of reading it, it would be don't bother engaging with the literal sense of those passages. If you wanted to try to engage with it, we can talk after. But in terms of like leaving that completely alone, you're absolutely like fine to do that. Okay? And the thing that is handed over to us, the way of reading that is handed over to us, like just to try and sum it up and like finish off there, Christ and our experience within the church are the very things that are handed over to us as tradition. Those are the sort of lenses, the prism by which we read the Old Testament. Yeah? And it's the Old Testament that tells us not about the Old Testament, but about Christ and the experience within the church. Okay? I would suggest, if you're particularly interested in trying to do that, trying to learn that reading, first look to the New Testament, then look to the Church Fathers, then it's not hidden, it's just not looked into because, forgive me for being like so foolish about this, we're a bit lazy. We're very lazy. Very lazy. I'm a bit lazy. We're very lazy. Okay? If we want to get into it, let's get into it. Yeah? There's a lot of like stuff that we can read and get into. And if you have questions that you think we haven't really answered or you want to get more examples, either speak to me after, or if you have any questions now, if I can't answer them, I'm genuinely happy to write them down and try and look into them now. So I'm happy to leave it there, unless there are any sort of questions, disagreements even. By all means, find me. Okay.
Thank you, John.
Just going to ask, why? I was just reminded of something from Father John's talk at Apologetics. He said one of the criteria for something being considered scripture is that it's cryptic.
Yeah.
Why?
That's that whole opening, right? So this idea that This idea that, okay, so let's see if this answers it. It might not, but I'll give it a go. When we try and think of how the Old Testament relates to the New Testament, one way of thinking about it is Old Testament is prophecy, New Testament is fulfillment. Yeah, would anyone agree that sounds okay? Yeah? Okay. I think part of the problem there is we buy into that too much too quickly. I don't think that's a good way of understanding things. Okay? Because there are certain things that are not prophecies at all, that the New Testament writers take as figures of Christ. Yeah? At no point does Moses talk about, like, the manna from heaven being this thing that's a figure of the Eucharist that'll come down like Christ himself, he's the bread from heaven. At no point does he say that. At no point is there a thing made about like crossing through the Red Sea, Moses saying, oh, and by the way, this is going to be a figure of like Christian baptism, like keep an eye out for it. He doesn't make a point of that being a prophecy. Yeah? And if we were to only mind the Old Testament for prophecies, the things that seem to be explicitly like not veiled, not cryptic, but things that are just explicitly sort of saying something will happen, like there will be a Messiah, he will save the people from their sins. Like, we get a very like restricted view of Christ. But the claim has always been that every part of the Old Testament speaks of Christ, and it speaks only after the death and the resurrection of Christ. In fact, it's justified by the death and resurrection of Christ. Why is it veiled? It is veiled. Yeah? Like, just by experience. No one was reading this, like Father John makes this point over and over again. It's a really solid historical point. No one was reading the Old Testament in this particular way. Christ dies and rises. The way that we read the Old Testament changes. That in and of itself is miraculous. Yeah? So it is veiled. Why? I'm asking. Yeah? Okay. Shall we leave it at that? By all means, we can speak after.